All right, good morning. So we're going to talk about stormwater emergency preparedness. So facts, hurricane facts, powerful tropical storm. A tropical storm is considered a hurricane when it reaches or exceeds 4 miles per hour. Hurricanes are also known as cyclones or typhoons, depending on the region they are. Hurricanes form over warm ocean waters near the equator. They need warm water to develop and use as fuel. They rapidly lose strength when they make inland. And as we know, they produce violent winds, heavy rain, tornadoes, storm surges, and flooding. Storm surge and flooding are the main cause of fatalities, and coastal regions where we live are areas with the greatest risk of hurricane. So when hurricane season starts, it's June 1st, and always I tell everybody it's the start of the season, and it runs through November 30th. Activity usually from late August through September, and if you can see that graph in the left corner, you can kind of see as the season, as we warm over those summer months, you can see that peak season where we have the most activity is September 10th, and then that graph kind of declines after that. On average, we have 10.1 named storms that occur each year, and about 5.9 on average actually hurricanes. We have 2.5 major hurricanes, category 3 or greater. They can bring winds, heavy downpours, power outages, and flooding concerns. So how to prepare community-wide. This is something that we talk to a lot of homeowners associations, property managers. You know, develop a plan of action so for the community and share with homeowners. We always recommend that a residential or community development have a stormwater maintenance contract. There's pond maintenance companies out there who provide that routine and preventive maintenance throughout the year to make sure that that stormwater facility is working as designed. So monitor your pond function, understand how your system works. So there's different types of stormwater facilities. There's wet ponds, dry ponds, and infiltration facilities. There's even underground systems. All of the plans for your community or development are available. We have them here at the Conservation District. So if you don't understand what type of stormwater facility that you have, please reach out to us and we can provide technical assistance. For the different ponds, they provide storage volume for the rain event. So if you have a wet pond where you see water, everything above that is the storage for a storm event. So for that 2, 10, and 100-year storm event, that's the area, that's the storage volume that we need. And then over hours it has stopped, that water should go down in a reasonable amount of time. So when you're looking at your stormwater facility, be aware of how it's supposed to function. Locate the outfall structure. So most stormwater facilities should have some type of structure that's regulating, controlling the water elevation, and understand where it discharges, meaning if it's going to a ditch, some type of waterway, take a look at that as well, because that can also impact how that stormwater facility is functioning. And as always, you know, if you're unclear on how your pond is supposed to work, please contact the Conservation District for assistance. So again, how to prepare community-wide. So watch your stormwater system before and after storm events to make sure it functions as designed. So when we have these 1-2 inch rain events, you know, really watch how the water is coming into the pond and how it's leaving the pond. So if you see that picture in the upper left corner, there's a concrete structure, and you can see a small hole on that concrete structure. And that is basically what we call the low flow orifice, and that's regulating the water elevation in the stormwater facility. So when the rainwater comes in, the surface water comes into the pond, the water will rise, and then it will discharge through those openings on the outlet structure and draw back down, and you're then able to regain that storage volume. So those are things that you want to be mindful of. If the pond is not regaining its storage volume, meaning it's not drawing down, then you need to investigate as to why. If there's a maintenance issue, a blockage. We have some communities that live in very active construction communities, and sometimes just building debris can blow into the pond or trash, and even a trash bag can block those orifices and restrict drainage. One thing we like to tell communities too, in preparation for a big storm, remember to turn those pond fill wells off. So some people in their developments have wells to maintain a permanent pool elevation. And so we need all the storage that we can for a tropical storm or hurricane. So we ask that those wells be turned off so that we can use all available storage. In general, stormwater ponds should draw back down to their design permanent pool several hours after a storm event. So depending on how your stormwater facility is designed, sometimes it may be a couple hours and sometimes it may be a couple of days. And it really depends on the size storm event that we have. So if we get that 100-year storm, which is 9.2 inches of rain in 24 hours, it's probably going to take up to 3 days for that pond to draw back down to its design permanent pool. And sometimes it'll happen much sooner. If it does not regain the storage volume, again, look at that outlet structure to see if there's an obstruction, trash, woody debris, and then also look at the outlet discharge location. Sometimes we have ditches that blow over in a ditch, and then that whole root system can block drainage. Or maybe a homeowner has done something. They've thrown something in the ditch that is restricting drainage. So there can be multiple reasons, but really be mindful of how the system works. And again, depending on the storm event, it may take hours to days for that pond to draw back down. So how to prepare individually. So do your part to keep debris out of the conveyance system, stormwater ponds, and outlet channels. So again, remember not to put any kind of clippings, Christmas trees, anything like that in the outfall ditch. Just remember to do your part and be mindful to pick trash up. And again, secure any items in your yard. We're going to have winds, a tropical storm or hurricane. Secure all of those items on your property so that they don't blow into the stormwater facility. Report clogged ditches and culverts to your HOA or a property management company so that they can be addressed prior to the storm event. Again, secure outdoor items and clear blockages if accessible. And be mindful of how your stormwater pond works. Watch your pond before and after storm events to make sure it functions as designed. And again, if there are concerns and the water is not draining, please reach out for assistance. So the 100-year design storm in Sussex County is 9.2 inches in 24 hours. So just recently, around July 10th, we had a storm event that occurred, and we had about 7.5 inches in about half that time frame. So that event actually exceeded the 100-year design storm. So that was probably about a 200-year storm event that occurred, and we did have some flooding in places throughout the county. So when we have an event like that, we anticipate that the ponds are going to be full. And in some cases, those ponds are going to come out of bank depending on the size storm event. So the stormwater facilities are sized to convey and sometimes, in some cases, manage. If it's a project under the current stormwater regulations, they will be managing that 100-year storm event. But if that event exceeds the 100-year storm, the pond will come out of bank and flood the roadside swales. And in some cases, as in this picture, the roadway during those events until the water is able to recede in several hours or days. So again, this is a picture just showing when we have an event that exceeds that 100-year design storm, ponds will come out of bank, and we will need all the storage capacity throughout the community. So meaning those roadside swales will be full, and in some cases there will be water over the road for a temporary period of time until that water is able to go down. So again, this is a picture from Hurricane Sandy. So you can see that all of those roadside swales in the community are full, and the system is functioning, as intended. So structures are protected, meaning the houses are up high, but all low areas will flood. So that will include the roads, the stormwater pond, everything that's below those house structures will flood before your home. So here is a picture of kind of the peak activity of that Hurricane Sandy. And you can see everything was inundated during that time. And this storm event was pretty much close to our 100-year design storm or slightly exceeded that storm event. So again, these are pictures that were taken this July when we had that storm event that was about 7.5 inches in roughly 10 hours. And you can see that ponds came out of bank. There just wasn't enough time for that water to drain out, and it backflowed onto roadways and out of catch basins for a period of time. But it did go down several hours after the event. So 100-year storm events or greater, ponds are at capacity. And if it exceeds the 100-year design storm, we are exceeding the capacity of those stormwater facilities. So again, these are just a couple pictures of from the July storm event. So that did exceed the 100-year design storm. And you can see the ponds are full, they are at capacity and getting pretty close to structures at this point. So this is just a general overview of what your community can do to prepare for a storm, as we are in hurricane season up until November 30th. So bottom line, please be safe. This presentation is just a general overview. Do not attempt to perform any inspection or maintenance during a storm event. So bottom line, just be safe. And this is just to guide you in preparing for this hurricane season. Thank you.
Jess, we have one question here about an HOA in Kent County is going to assume responsibility for their detention ponds, the wet and dry, in the next year or so. And is it typical to have a county come in and review those facilities prior to the turnover to ensure everything is working correctly and as planned?
Yeah. Yes, they should reach out to the Kent Conservation District and request an inspection where they meet with them and walk through the community and just educate them on how the pond's supposed to work. And then they can also verify with the Kent Conservation District that the as-built have been approved and that everything is in compliance.
All right, so we're going to talk about algae control this morning in stormwater management ponds, which if you live in a development and you have a stormwater pond, I imagine that you've come across algae issues in your ponds before. So today we'll just revisit what a wet pond standard design looks like. May look like what you have, may not. There's a bunch of different designs out there, but just kind of going over and show some points of reference with your stormwater pond. Introduce you to algae, some of the species, the different types that are out there. And then we'll also talk about some plants that sometimes are mistaken from algae, especially if they're seen from far away. If you're passing by in a car or something, a green sheen on top of a pond doesn't necessarily mean it's algae. It could be some of these other plants. You know, why are algae blooms issues and what causes these algae blooms? And then we'll talk about some short and long-term controls of algae. And my main take-home message is, at the end of the day, nutrient management and reducing the amount of nutrient load in stormwater ponds is going to help. We'll call it prevent algae, but there's not really a preventative other than nutrient management. So a wet pond, it has a permanent pool. That's why there's algae issues. You're not going to see those in most of your other types of stormwater management areas because they just don't have a permanent pool, and algae needs that to grow. You know, the management of the permanent pool is difficult. Water quality issues, obviously overabundance of nutrients in there cause algae issues. There's also public safety issues, which is why you'll see bench shelves around the pond. So here's a standard design, and this is what you would hope for. A lot of them, as you can see here, where my cursor is on the left screen here, is most ponds have the inlets flowing into a forebay. And this is good because it helps collect all of the sediment that's running off with your normal stormwater runoff. And that's how phosphorus, as we'll talk about a little bit later on, that's how its main way of getting into stormwater ponds happens, is through that type of runoff. If you don't have a forebay, that's going directly into your pond, and it's going to cause bigger issues over time. You'll have sedimentation, and your pond bottom will come up over time. But again, I haven't actually personally been a part of any kind of dredging operations or anything of a stormwater pond and never seen it required. You know, maybe the conservation district has, but at the end of the day, forebays are supposed to prevent that from happening. And, you know, you want to keep those forebays clear. As Jess mentioned earlier in her presentation, you'll end up having outflows that end up outletting either to a ditch or some other system that eventually makes it into the bigger watershed and on out to where it outlets into the bigger watersheds. So once you have post-construction, which is where most of the homeowners associations and private contractors, their focus on wet ponds is to maintain compliance and functionality for many reasons. Obviously, as you heard earlier, for storm preparedness, for aesthetics, for water quality, and there's also some opportunities to enhance those stormwater ponds to make habitat for local wildlife or to help with pollinator protection. Obviously, do your preventative maintenance for stormwater control, for storm preparedness, things like that, keeping your structures unclogged. And another reason why is because algae can clog up these structures, especially if it sticks to some of that organic debris and trash and everything else. And once you get a clogged outlet structure, it'll very quickly decrease the amount of storage that you have in your stormwater pond. It can happen pretty quickly. So we'll go into algae. What are algae? So algae is the plural, alga, and a single algae cell is called an alga, but you know, they're unicellular, they do not have roots. Normally what they'll do is they begin on the bottom of the pond. They'll start to develop on the substrate, and after a while they will float to the surface, which that's why sometimes you might, pond is perfectly clear, it looks great, and then you wake up the next morning and it's like, what in the world has happened? I have a huge algae bloom. And basically what has happened is that it's spent its time developing in the bottom of the pond and then floats up together. A little bit of algae is present in all aquatic ecosystems, and they're actually very important to the health of the ponds. But that's if they don't get out of control, because algae supplies habitat and food sources for macroinvertebrates, fish species, things like that, amphibians and other herps that live in these ponds and these areas. And they also provide dissolved oxygen to the water column, along with other plant life in ponds. You know, one of the byproducts of photosynthesis is dissolved oxygen in the water column. But what happens is, and we'll talk about a little bit more later, is once, if you have an overpopulation of algae, you'll get the dissolved oxygen deposited during the day, but then at night, as natural decomposition happens with algae, you'll end up getting the decomposition process uses up that dissolved oxygen, and that's where you get fish kills. All right, and mainly you won't see them a lot, especially getting out of control in streams or you know, water bodies that they're continually moving. They like stagnant water, which is why you'll see some water movers and aeration to help with this. So your green algae is one of the big ones where you will see a mat forming algae that happens on top of your pond. It's really unsightly. It can smell. It can also clog up your inlets and outlets. And those are the big issue with, as far as aesthetics is concerned, and also functionality. You have your blue-green algae, your cyanobacteria. Those are the ones you might hear in the news about being having some toxins involved with them and causing issues. We do have some here in Delaware that may cause some issues with your pets or your livestock, but we don't have any of the major issues that you'll see in other parts of the world where you know, they're extremely harmful to human health. So green algae, again, they're filamentous, they're mat forming, and you know, they're mostly green, but some of them can appear to be black, brown, or blackish green. And again, they're actually a very healthy part of a regular aquatic ecosystem, but can quickly go out of control, especially with an overabundance of nutrients in the water column. And again, they grow on the bottom and then end up floating up to the top. And those are the gases that form underneath, and that's how they to get forward. So basically, if there's a lot of sunlight hitting the bottom of your stormwater pond and you have an overabundance of nutrients, you can expect to be dealing with algae. You know, and a lot of these permanent pools are designed to be 6 foot or less. And, you know, you're going to get quite a bit of light hitting the bottom in there, especially if you have a pretty clear system. A couple of the species that you might see is the Pithophora, which that's the horsehair algae you tend to see a little bit more in the mid to late summer. It's one of those ones where you might see this little patch of it sitting on top of the pond, but then when if you go to pull it up, it just has this long, stringy horsehair-like appearance to it, and it's very difficult to control when it gets established. You know, you might need a few higher rates of any chemical controls that you do, and then if you're trying to physically remove it, it's a nightmare. You have Spirogyra. They're bright green, slimy mats, but they are a little bit more easier to control, whether you're physically removing them or trying to control them chemically. And then there's Hydrodictyon. It's another mat-forming, spongy, net-like algae that has a hexagonal or pentagonal pattern. Most of the time, if you're going to positively identify algae, you're going to want to do it underneath a microscope. But a lot of times you'll be able to tell if it's filamentous, and that's really what separates it for what type of control that you're going to use. Another type of algae is Chara. It's another green filamentous algae, but it actually anchors itself to the substrate and will grow on the bottom of ponds. And it doesn't root, but it's just got an anchor there, and it's the same thing as algae, except it just looks a little bit more like a plant. It can form dense stands, especially with an overabundance of nutrients. But again, this is one of the big healthy algae that you'll find in ponds around here. And if it's not growing out of control, there's really no need to control it unless it gets out of control. And a good way to tell the difference between this algae and maybe some pond weeds is if you pull up a clump of it and you squeeze it, it pops. You'll feel like this little pop, this little air bubbles in there. And here's some of the pictures of what you can see. Obviously in the top right here, that's what the Cara looks like. That's where it kind of looks like a little bit of a pond weed. But again, once you pull it up, you'll see that it doesn't have roots. And also you'll be able to feel the little popping sensation. Here in the top left, this is you kind of see the net-like appearance of the Hydrodiction. And then the two at the bottom here, the one on the bottom right is the horsehair algae. You can kind of see how just dense it is and how, like, once you start to pull it up, it's like this never-ending string of algae. And then also in the bottom left, this is the other green algae that forms a mat that's pretty easy to scoop off the top. You won't have the long strands underneath. Then you go to the blue-green algae, the cyanobacteria. It forms like a pond scum, or the pea soup is what we used to call the look of it. And it's pretty easy to see. If you look at a pond, it just has this green appearance, and it's not like a matte green. It's just, you know, the pond just looks like a pea soup. That's when you can kind of tell that there's going to be some blue-green algae in there. And a lot of these are really detrimental just to the health of the pond because of the boom and the amount of algae that's there. You might see this big mat of algae and think, oh my goodness, there's a lot of algae there. But if it's you know, underneath of that, there's not as much. But then when you have the blue-green algae explosions in ponds, it's all throughout the water column. It's everywhere. And this is really where you get the dissolved oxygen issues, because the sheer amount of algae that dies per day in that system, you know, just uses up a ton of the dissolved oxygen, and it very quickly lowers that level to critical levels, and then you'll have fish kills. And generally, what will happen is you'll experience in the morning that the fish were fine the day before, and then at night they've lost the amount of oxygen they need, and then they die. And some of these species also fix nitrogen, so they can actually, you know, even if an area may not have as much of the nutrients flowing into the pond, they can actually fix nitrogen from the atmosphere and also continue to cause more problems. And then also some of these algae will excrete toxins, you know, and they'll cause a few issues in livestock, people, your dogs. You don't want them swimming in there. And then some of them can be a little bit more dangerous and cause maybe some neurotoxicity or some kidney or liver problems. Some of the species that you'll find around, Microcystis, that's the one where it's more of that pea soup appearance. These actually do contain a small hepatotoxin, microcystin, and that's where you'll get the incontinence, or you'll get some possible kidney or liver issues, but they're not the ones that are going to be fatal for the most part. Lyngbia is actually a mat forming blue-green algae, where they kind of create a little bit more groups and that look a little bit more like the green algae when they form mats, but you can tell they're just a little bit different by when you pick them up, and it's not as together and grouped as you would find the green algae. These can cause a little bit of skin irritations, but they're not going to be having long-term issues either. And then Anabina is one of the more dangerous ones, and they're another one that kind of looks like it's a pea soup colonizing cyanobacteria, and these do have some neurotoxins, and they also have the hepatotoxins in there as well. You know, haven't really heard about those being a giant issue around here, but again, if you have a pond and you're seeing the pea soup appearance, it might not hurt to contact NREC and try to get them to identify what type of algae you have. Here's what it'll look like. You can kind of see here in the top left that you got that pea soup type of look to it, and the same thing here in the center. You might have a little bit of aggregation along this, but this is generally what you're going to see. And then on the right, you'll see that's that mat forming Lyngbia. That's a blue-green. It's not quite as you won't see the aggregates being quite the same as the green algae forming like solid mats, but it still obviously can be very unsightly and create issues in ponds. So we move on to plants that are mistaken for algae. You know, what type of plants that we can come across. And one of them is common duckweed. It's a small floating plant that actually does have some small roots on the fronds. It's 1 to 3 fronds / leaves per plant. And it reproduces by seed and asexual budding. So that's another one of those that, you know, you can see it as a small amount one day, and then by the end of the week, it could be really threatening to cover the pond. Again, it's another beneficial plant, especially if there's a native species of it. There is an Asian duckweed that is a little bit bigger that we definitely don't want around. But in small amounts, you know, duckweed is not bad. You know, it's good for waterfowl and other macroinvertebrates, fish, things like that use this as part of their normal life cycle. But again, you know, in slow moving eutrophic waters, which nutrient rich waters, they become an issue very quickly. And, you know, they'll cover the surface, and treatment for those get a little bit more difficult, especially since you don't want to treat an entire pond that's covered with these plants, because they will definitely, the decomposition will use up the dissolved oxygen quickly, killing most of what's in there. Watermeal is another one. This is a more grainy looking plant, you know, very quickly covers ponds. A lot of times you'll see maybe some irrigation ponds around farms. You can get this in it pretty heavily, and it's a really, really hard one to control. I never really had a lot of success with that when I worked in these systems, and you know, there are ways to do it, but it's a little bit more difficult. You definitely want to get these when they're in a small population. So here you go. This is a good picture showing both of them. The bigger plants that you can see with like the little fronds and leaves, that's the duckweed, and the smaller grainy ones is watermeal. Again, they usually you'll find them growing together, but if you go by a pond that's just bright green, almost a neon green, completely covered, most likely it's not algae in there. It's most likely going to be duckweed and watermeal. Not to say that algae isn't underneath of it, but that's really what this is, and it's a difficult plant to take care of. And here's another picture of just what a pond can look like. And this is just, I mean, they're just wall to wall covered with these plants, and it's going to be an issue trying to get that under control. You almost might want to just wait till next year if you don't have a harvester or something like that, and get it when it's a small population a little earlier in the year. So why are we worried about algae blooms? Well, quite obviously, they're very unsightly, and sometimes they have unpleasant smells. So those are the number one reasons that most homeowners associations and homeowners will have with algae issues. But then you also have that they can clog the outfall structures, creating less storage space and higher potential for flooding if you have a big rain event. Reduced water storage capacity, as I said, reduced diversity in plant life and in what lives in the pond. A lot of times you could tell about the health of an aquatic system based on the macroinvertebrates. So if you have a heavily eutrophic system where there are a lot of algae issues, most of the time you might not find any fish or herps using that at all. You might just find red worms and leeches and things like that living there. And it also reduces dissolved oxygen just because of the die-off and use of dissolved oxygen in that decomposition process overnight. You know, so what causes algae blooms? Well, for one, they do like the shallow, stagnant water that doesn't move. And then they like the high nutrient load. You know, nitrogen and phosphorus are the limiting factors in algae blooms. If you have an overpresence of nitrogen and especially phosphorus, that's where you're going to have your major issues with algae. And honestly, that's what these ponds are designed for, right? They're designed to be the last line of defense against stormwater runoff and stormwater management. So it's supposed to collect the sediment. It's supposed to collect the nutrients and the pollutants to stop them from getting in the system. But as we'll talk about later on, we can reduce the amount of stress on these systems by what we do around the house and what we do in our open spaces and things like that. And phosphorus, again, it binds to the sediment very readily, and that's usually how it ends up in stormwater ponds, but it also can be deposited by geese, a little bit of fertilizer runoff, and then also organic material runoff as well. Nitrogen is more mobile in the soil solution, so a big rain event, if you've just put some fertilizer down, and it's nitrogen heavy, there's a good chance to lose nitrogen just because it doesn't bind to the soil as heavily. So I put this on there, and there's a lot going on here. You do not need to remember this, but there's just wanted to point out that there's a nitrogen cycle of how it moves around in the environment, and kind of where the problems come in and why we end up seeing eutrophication or high levels in our water. Some of it happens because of fertilizer runoff, but a lot of the farmers nowadays have the conservation practices in place that helps reduce that amount. You know, we have the nutrient management that creates plans for farmers and homeowners in order to properly fertilize. So this is becoming less and less of an issue over time just because of how we're managing it. But then again, you know, other things like people dumping yard waste. Like if you've walked along like a tax ditch or some kind of private ditch, and you see like there's just this loads of yard waste that people dump right there on the side of the ditch. It's like, that's a direct way for you to just dump nitrogen and phosphorus right into the water system, and that's just not going to help things. You know, you need to find alternate uses of grass clippings or yard waste. You know, there's other things you can do, and you know, just trying not to let it get straight into those stormwater ponds and conveyance systems. This guy right here is, you know, I've tried to find like some studies that could give me really solid numbers on exactly, you know, what amount of phosphorus and nitrogen is being deposited in these ponds, but I couldn't really find any solid numbers, but I did find this. So according to National Geographic, 50 Canada geese, which 50 is not, it's not hard to find that many in any of your developments around there. I'm sure anybody here can attest to that. But 50 Canada geese can produce up to 2.5 tons of excrement per year. I mean, just that's amazing. It's crazy. I found some studies also that said they defecate like every 2 minutes or something crazy like that, which if you have an open space with Canada geese around there, I'm sure you know exactly how much they deposit. Again, here's the phosphorus cycle. It moves around a little differently than nitrogen does. It has a different source of where it comes from. But the key here is that phosphorus binds tightly to the soil. When it becomes an issue is once the phosphorus buildup in the soil gets too much, the soil can't hold on to it, that's when it starts to move. Or also when sediment becomes unstable, and when it runs off into the pond, phosphorus goes with it. Organic material, again, once it decays, releases the phosphorus into the water column, and that's where you have the issues. Another source of phosphorus is this guy again. You know, I can't mention enough how, especially migratory Canada geese can really cause issues in ponds, and there's definitely ways to prevent them from making their presence felt. And one of those is a healthy vegetative buffer and riparian buffer. They don't like walking through that stuff. They know that predators live there. So even just having that will help a lot. All right, again, fertilization practices, they've changed over the years. The nutrient management program, the ways that folks are applying fertilizer has gotten better. And I'll be honest, it really seems like farmers have that under control, whereas the landscape and turf business is still a little bit, we can improve that. And we have been working on that with livable landscapes and things like that, and training you know, landscapers and fertilizers in the turf industry. And that's also something we can do on our own. Whereas if we're fertilizing our own yards, getting the soil test done, putting it down what we need, when we need it, is definitely the key to helping reduce the amount of phosphorus getting into the. And yard waste is another one. I said it before, but also I've seen times when folks are cutting their grass near a system or a drainage system, even if it's like your like a small conveyance system along the roadside or something like that, and blowing the grass right in there. That's a direct way to put nutrients and phosphorus into the water column. They're just trying to find ways to reduce doing that and just being conscious when you're working around these ponds. So once we get to that point, now what do we do? Now that we know that we have an algae problem, we've already gotten behind the 8 ball, we're behind the battle, and now we just need to take immediate action to control what's there. So what can we do? We can do physical removal, we can do chemical treatment, or a combination of the two. Now, physical removal is definitely the best way to take care of this. Okay, are there any other questions about what we've gone over so far?
That the vegetative buffers definitely helped with geese around our pond at home. That, you know, early in the season when the plants were short, we did have some geese in there, but since then I haven't had any.
Right. Right.
And
Exactly.
that's been, and someone asked the width of the buffer and what plants are in it. I'm going to be honest, it's whatever grows up around the pond at my house. It's actually an old irrigation pond that we have on our property. And so, you know, I let whatever native plants are around in there. I do have something like dogbane and some other brambles and all kinds of stuff because we love to have rabbits around the house. But yeah, any you know, elevated plant material around that pond is really important. They just don't like walking through that.
Right, exactly. And one of the things I always say is just treating the buffer kind of like a meadow. You know, keeping the woody stems out of the Riparian Buffer. And, you know, maybe you can get some of those as farther out from around the pond, but yeah, just kind of managing it as a meadow. Usually you'll get a good amount of native beneficial species there, but just having, you know, whoever manages that area scout for any invasive species or any problematic species is definitely something you want to do. You know, so again, so removing algae, physical removal, as I was going to say earlier, it's the best way to help the pond in general, but it's going to be the most difficult and labor intensive way because once with the physical removal, you're actually removing nutrients at the same time. So if you chemically treat algae, it dies, it decays, and a lot of that nutrient's going to get released right back into the water column, and you're in this never-ending cycle. So physical removal is the best, but obviously at times you can't do that. And if you treat algae in a smaller, when it's in a smaller aggregate and population, you know, it's just a lot better to be able to keep up with that. But again, the immediate actions are to just take care of what's there now. And if you want to be really successful, you have to go to long-term nutrient management. And that's going to be community-wide, and it starts with homeowners. Here's an example of physical removal. You know, this is a lot of algae, and it was done by hand. And it's still probably removed maybe 1/10 of what was there. It was good because that's a lot of nutrients that you remove. It's a lot of algae, but at the end of the day, it's not going to be the end all. So you still had to do some chemical treatments after that. So obviously, if you're going to be using pesticides in and around ponds, whether it's algicides or you're treating plants in and around the ponds, you got to make sure that you're using products that have been approved for use in aquatic systems. A lot of research and testing has gone into these, and a lot of the difference between most of the terrestrial products when compared to the aquatic products is the surfactants in them. And, you know, they just are just different, less dangerous to aquatic life adjuvants. So the surfactants are not going to be harmful to the macroinvertebrates and fish, and a lot of the chemicals aren't either. But one of the algicides, a major one that works really well is copper sulfate, or you have different iterations of it, whether it's chelated copper sulfate or, you know, just other formulations where copper is the actual thing that's killing the algae. It comes in different forms. It can be a granular, where a granular will be good if you're trying to treat some of those algae that are either developing on the bottom of the pond or anchored on the bottom of the pond. They come in liquids. But the problem there is if you have a smaller pond, or you have some fish such as koi or trout, it can be potentially toxic to them. And then it also has activity on some pond weeds, especially hydrilla. Hydrilla is another one that can be a problem in stormwater ponds, and this has activity on it as well. So you can kind of kill two birds with one stone there. If you have koi and trout and you want to be a little safer, there's a sodium carbonate peroxyhydrate, and that's basically almost like a hydrogen peroxide, how it bubbles up. So it basically just gets into the algae and bursts them, and that's how it kills it. It's safe for those koi ponds, goldfish, trout, things like that. And another thing is that algae should be treated above 60 degrees. Will it work underneath that? Possibly, but at the end of the day, you're going to have the most efficacy. And, you know, obviously, if we're using pesticides at all, we want to make sure that we're using them when and where we should, so that we don't have to overuse it. So again, the long-term management, it's the nutrients. Those are the reasons why you have algae. Those are the reasons why you're going to have a continual problem. So if you just continue using algicides to control it, it's going to be in this vicious cycle where you're going to be doing it over and over and over again. And if you don't handle the nutrients, that's going to be the issue. So some of the things that you can do is if you already have a bunch of phosphorus in your stormwater column, you can actually do there's basic tests out there that you can probably find at Home Depot, Lowe's, some of the other stores, where it's just, you can just do a basic test to figure out how much, like if you're getting a reading of phosphorus at all in your water column, that's too much. So that, you know at that point that you're going to need to do some precipitation of that. There's a few products out there. I can't give you trade names, but I can give you some of the active ingredients that are listed there. And they actually bind up the phosphorus that's in the water column and drops it to the bottom of the pond and just adds it to the substrate. So it's not available to algae. Over time, can it break down again and become available again? It's possible, but it's definitely a good way to remove it from the water column and get ahead of the game on there. And then again, so the sediment, that's how it gets in. That's how it ends up combining over time and building up, is the sediment, and that's why the forebays are crucial. So if you have a forebay in your pond, getting them emptied on a regular basis is pretty big in order to help not only sedimentation, but also with reducing the amount of phosphorus in your pond. Riparian buffers is a huge one. Just capturing nitrogen as it's trying to flow and sheet flow into the pond, it's huge. The plants take that up there readily. And also preventing the sheet runoff from washing phosphorus-filled sediment into the ponds and things like that. Bench shelf plantings is another one. The bench shelf is that safety shelf that's about 6 inches deep. I don't remember exactly how wide they are, but usually it's enough so that if you step off the edge of the pond, you're not falling 8 feet into the bottom of the pond. It's there for safety reasons, but you also should stabilize those with some plantings, and that can also help take up some of the phosphorus and nitrogen there as well. But if you do that, you want to also make sure that if you have a buildup of organic material, just trying to remove some of that, especially if it's a lot. Like if you have a bunch of trees around ponds, the leaf buildup in there can be pretty heavy, and you want to take care of that. Aeration is another one that helps with long-term management, and that really just kind of gets the water moving around, and it's just less likely for algae to grow and stuff that's moving around. And even if it's not necessarily an aerator, there's water movers out there as well. But then you have your at-home things like rain gardens and rain barrels. A little more on phosphorus precipitation. Lanthanum and clay is a really good one where it permanently locks free reactive phosphorus from the water column. It costs a lot of money, and it's kind of hard to apply, but once it's a really effective tool for knocking down the amount of phosphorus that's there. But again, it's going to get the phosphorus that's there at the time. And then if some is going to be released from the bottom of the pond, if there's extra still left sitting on the bottom of the pond, it'll bind that up. But if you're not attacking where the phosphorus is coming from, again, this is going to be just a continual problem. So if you continually have sediment that's washing into the pond, if you continually have homeowners or whatever, putting too much phosphorus on their lawns and it continues to wash in there, then this is just another thing where you're going to be in that vicious cycle of just continually putting this in there to solve that problem. Aluminum sulfate's another one. Binds phosphorus, same thing. It also binds sediment, though. That's another good one. So if you have a turbid pond, and turbidity is simply solids floating in the pond, and most of the time that's sediment that's suspended there. And a lot of times you'll find that in, if you have excessive runoff, or if you have, a big storm event, that's when you'll see the cloudy appearance of your pond. This can help clarify that while also binding the phosphorus there. Again, sediment removal, the forebays, best way to attack that. So the forebays are very key for that, and again, if you don't have the forebay, maybe asking whoever is managing your pond to pay attention to the inlets. And if you're seeing sediment build up in front of your inlets, trying to remove that. Full pond dredges may be required. Again, I haven't participated in any of those. Maybe the conservation district may have more information on that. And then stabilize your areas that are at risk of eroding, because again, the phosphorus getting into the pond binded to sediment is a big way that happens. Again, riparian buffers, You know, we've heard, you know, a 3 foot minimum buffer, but the more the better. So obviously the more buffer that you have around the pond is going to help with you know, preventing nutrients from getting in there. And it also has many other benefits as well. And especially, so the riparian buffer, you should be selecting for the native grasses, forbs, and maybe some shrubs. You don't want trees really close to the edge of the pond because of risk of falling over and destabilizing the bank. But as you move farther out into the system, then that would be something good to add into that. Here's some bench shelf plantings we were talking about. You can see here that this whole bench shelf is pretty stabilized with, you know, maybe a little bit too much with the same plant. This is pickerel weeds, a great plant to stabilize bench shelves. Maybe a little bit too much of the same thing, but still, it's creating habitat. It's a native species. I see pollinators on them all the time. They love it. And it's really good at stabilization and using up nutrients. The vegetated perimeter, as we were talking about earlier, you know, it helps with nutrient management, but also helps reduce geese using the pond. If you have a nice healthy buffer, especially if it's bigger, they're not walking through that. You might have some resident geese, so you're not going to be able to get rid of all of them. But, you know, it definitely helps take care of that, and also helps capture a lot of nutrients and runoff. You can plant trees and shrubs as in the vegetated perimeter, which is past the embankment, which is past the regular riparian buffer. It generally is the area that's not on a slope around. So that's where you can start maybe planting some of your trees and shrubs. And, you know, obviously you want to look at your operation and management plan for your pond to make sure that's okay. But most of the time, the more that you're doing to stabilize and improve that area, the better. Some of the management issues though, when you start doing that, is invasive species management, which you'll hear from the man, the myth, the legend, Todd Davis after me about managing invasive species. But and you're also going to find differing opinions on what it looks like. You know, I've had times where, you know, you manage an open space and you think it just looks wonderful. It's natural looking. And, you know, it has some wildflowers, but it also has a lot of good grasses and some shrubs. And somebody come and tell you, this is ugly, this is unmanaged, this is terrible. And then you'll have other people who think it look great. So that just managing those opinions and expectations is really big. And it'll be a little bit time consuming. But the best thing you can do is a consistent scouting regimen, walking through the area, seeing what's there, finding invasive populations when they're small. That's the big thing. And then you can just keep ahead of the game. So the embankment is a pretty important one to stabilize, because this is the area that you'll generally see starts to erode if you have disturbance in there or if it's not properly maintained. But that's where your plantings should only be herbaceous. You should only be letting grasses and forbs grow there. And there's a lot of opportunity with the types of things that grow there. Here is some goldenrod. And I put this picture here specifically because I visited this pond. I believe I was working with Todd at the time at the Department of Ag, but I was called by a concerned homeowner saying that they had an abundance of ragweed that was causing them issues with their health. And obviously that's something that's concerning. We wanted to check it out, but this is not ragweed. Ragweed is inconspicuous. It's not going to be this. This is a wonderful plant, and there's a lot of different species of goldenrod, and it's really good for late season forage for pollinators. But again, I just wanted to make sure that folks know that this is not ragweed. This is goldenrod. Some more management issues. Again, the same with the vegetated buffer is that you'll have invasive species and some other weed species that may try to take advantage of that opportunity. So scouting and catching those when they're small is good. Yeah, the erosion potential is there if it's disturbed, or if you keep it mowed, it's a little bit more likely to erode. And then it's a slope terrain too, so it's a little bit more dangerous to manage that area. So if you got a good established vegetative cover there, that's good. And then sometimes you'll find muskrats burrowing, you know, through into the slope and then up to make an exit hole. They can be pretty prolific at times, and just again, scouting and making sure that they don't become a problem is big. So again, this is some of the invasive plant species that I've seen around ponds. You know, hydrilla, multiflora rose. You got your autumn olive, Bradford pear, porcelain berry, purple loosestrife, and Phragmites, and you'll hear about some of them in a little bit. If you have issues with them, check out the Delaware Invasive Species Council. They can help you out, and also the Delaware Wetland Plant Field Guide. has been released by DNREC, and it can help you identify potentially invasive species. Upland native plants that you can plant in your vegetative buffers or in your riparian buffers. Here's some websites so we have some literature that has been done over the years that give you a list of native plants that you can plant in these areas. And then to find where to purchase these plants, going to the DNLA website, they have a listing of the native plant dealers throughout Delaware, whether it's wholesale or resale. Wetland native plants that you'd be planting in the bench shelves and more aquatic areas, again, to identify which types are around. The wetland plant field guide is a great option for that. Kind of shows you what is naturally occurring in Delaware and just give you some ideas on what you can plant. And again, going back to the native plant dealers, you should be able to find some dealers that carry some of these. And some of them specialize in aquatic plants where others focus more terrestrial. We talk about winter organic removal. Again, if you just have a lot of organic material that ends up in the pond, maybe removing that helps reduce the amount of nutrients back in there. But if you have a static system where like you don't have a bunch of additionally introduced organic material or nutrients, this shouldn't be as big of a thing. But just avoid getting your yard waste in there, avoid dumping anything close to it, and trying to reduce the amount of sediment that goes in there is the biggest part.
So Blake, while we're on that, some people had questions about what do you do with the removed algae if you've got, overabundance, and when it's removed, can you just leave it on the bank of the pond?
Not leave it on the bank, but composting it is definitely a way to take care of it. Obviously, you'd want to find a place that's not going to wash right back into the pond or cause any other issues. But yeah, definitely composting it is the way to do that. So aeration, there's, and I know I'm running a little short on time, but so I'll be quick. So you got diffused air and you got surface aeration. Diffused air is generally from the bottom of the pond moving up, and that really helps move water and provides a more efficient introduction of dissolved oxygen. Surface aeration looks better, not as efficient as putting dissolved oxygen into the water column, but it does move the water better. And then water movers, like you put them in a finger of a pond or something like that to keep water moving. Moving water deters the growth of algae. It's just the nature of how it works. So keeping the water moving helps. Not going to solve it without other things involved, but that's the thing. So as I was talking about earlier, nutrient removal at home and reducing your environmental footprint at home is the biggest way to help reduce the amount of algae and nutrient load in your stormwater management systems and in the watershed as a whole. Rain gardens is a way. So if if you can go outside in the storm and you can see where your runoff is going, you can watch it go right down to the street. You can see most of the time it kind of takes a direct path, like right over your lawn, right down into the street. So you can change where it goes. You can put it into a rain barrel. You can filter it out in a rain garden, things like that. Just trying to figure out ways to reduce the environmental footprint in general. And another way to do that is changing your turf. Like, all right, so maybe you don't need 2 acres of managed turf. Maybe you just need 1 acre, and then you can turn the other acre into tree planting or a meadow or something like that. Any bit will help. And then also like the simple things, like most of you probably already do this, directing gutters away from straight impervious surfaces, run them over your lawn. So at least you get a little bit of infiltration and sediment capture. And it's even better if you can direct them into a system that has a filter or rain gardens in there. And reduce the amount of pervious hardscapes. There's over here on the right, you can see there's things that can be installed that are pervious that actually lets some infiltration, whether it's pervious concrete or some other materials that you can put that are stabilizing the area and you can park on and things like that or walk on, but they allow water to go through. Here's an example of a rain garden here. They can look good. They might be a little bit management intensive, but again, it's one of those things where if you keep up on it, it's not as hard. Rain barrels, I have them in my house. I use them all the time for watering my potted plants and things like that. So, they fill up pretty quick, even on a regular smaller storm. Here's some of the stormwater management resources. Again, just check these out a little bit later on. And also make sure that if you have, a big system community-wide that you can't manage on your own, make sure that you're reaching out to your private consultants to help them take care of you. Permits are required when you're applying aquatic pesticides. That's something more for your manager to take care of, but just being aware that that's something that you need. You can read up on those. Also, if you're using anything as far as a registered pesticide, you need to be a certified pesticide applicator, unless you're doing your own private land. But I would suggest getting it anyway, just to make sure that you have the knowledge of how to use the materials and know where to look on a label when you're using it. So here's the general certified applicators, what they have for working around these systems in open space and stormwater ponds. This is the type of thing that you'll see. And mosquito control is really just, you may have a few companies out here who specialize in that, but most of the time it's not something that the regular managers do. And here's the before and after picture. You can see that this is a little bit different time of year, but this was probably like a month apart. But this pond was, overtaken by algae, and then with a little bit of treatment. This is how it can look with putting the Band-Aid on. So this was just treating the algae and getting it under control, and this is what it can look like. So it's doable, but in order to have this on the left on a regular basis, you really just need to look at the nutrient management as a whole, and starting at your home and trying to get your neighbors to do the same thing. And so again, just looking at the big picture, our human activity stresses these systems out. It's just how it is. It doesn't make us bad people. It doesn't make us irresponsible. It just makes us have to look at what we're doing and how we can do it a little bit better to decrease our environmental footprint on the environment as a whole, but more specifically into your community-wide drainage systems. If each house adopts these techniques, then just the stress on your system is going to go way down. And I apologize about the interruptions from my dogs. I'm sure that you heard the whining in the background, but that's the nature of what we're doing these days. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to let me know.
One question has been, has anyone introduced swans to their pond to discourage Canadian geese?
I have not heard of that. And that's one of those things where if you're introducing any kind of animal or biological control, you would definitely want to go through, I'm sure DNREC or even the Department of Agriculture for permit requirements and things like that. So no, I've not heard of that. It's happening. I think that the swans that you saw in those pictures were they were residents in there, and they were there to stay. And they're pretty nasty individuals too. So you know how Canadian geese can be nasty when they're nesting. Swans they're pretty territorial as well. So they might look pretty, but they're pretty evil for sure.
One of the things I will share that around my pond, when it comes to invasive species that I've found, I've never had porcelain berry before until about 3 years ago. And I know Blake mentioned that, and I know Todd will mention that. It's been a very big issue in the Milford area, but any waterway here in Delaware, especially in Sussex, you can tend to find that, something else called Japanese knotweed, all these things that we need to be sure that even though we may have a great area, that constant and occasional checking for invasive species is important, because birds can deliver a lot of, I love having them in my yard, but I have to constantly look and be sure that I don't have craziness coming up alongside those native plants and other plants that I have in my yard.
For the Department of Agriculture, environmental program manager, I work with noxious weeds and the Sea Lab. Today I'll talk about some invasive plants that we deal with, and I'll also have a commercial up front on our noxious weeds. I'll go through them kind of quick. Go ahead, Tracy. Kind of have to get this subject out there. There's been a lot of bad press for Roundup, whether it be Roundup or some other products along that way, the glyphosate. A lot of what I talk about uses these products different ways, and my take on it is I started spraying with this product in 1975. I've had exposure every year, and I'm health-wise fine. So I'll be suggesting it. If you were to go away from it, the products that are available are actually more of a soil contaminant type issue. So we're working in houses and around water, so we have to kind of keep some of those other products out. Go ahead, Tracy. noxious weed program started back in the 70s. Here's an article from 1977. They started with Johnson grass. It's still a problem. It's still a problem across the country and the world. Johnson grass right now is along the roadsides. We're seeing it 4 to 5 feet tall. It's trying to seed out. So we're out. Garrett and I are treating roadsides. DelDOT's treating some roadside spots also. This is one that when there's dirt moved around throughout the state and region, it could end up around the stormwater ponds. We see it when they do culvert repairs a lot of times. It's one that glyphosate or Roundup works on. There's also some other products that only kill grass. You see in there Select, Fusilade, and Post. They're labeled on field crops and vegetables. For turf and ornamental, we have products called Envoy and Ornamac 170. They're the same as the Select and Fusilade, just in a different labeled product. You're trying to get a product that's labeled for the site you're working on. If this was in your yard and you're mowing weekly, over time it would suppress it and it probably would go away, but the seeds last for several years. So if you let it go to seed, the problem's going to be there for a long time.
So Todd, I think
Pardon?
one of the things I say that if you think you have this, clipping the seed heads off, if nothing else, is important so that we're not spreading.
A lot of times we dig it up if it's a single plant. It has a large root. I'll show a picture of in a minute. So cutting the seed heads and or digging it up, just make sure you get all the roots when you do that. A characteristic on this grass is a white midrib, which is the middle section of the leaf. If you're confused, sometimes that's an easy way to ID it. Once it seeds out, it's usually 5 or 6 feet tall with a distinct seed head with red seeds on it that birds like to move around. There's a seed head picture. Pretty mature. Once you get to that stage, you've got seed heads going, or seeds that are alive. One of the other noxious weeds is Canada thistle. We have this very serious problem in Kent and Newcastle counties. The issue with it, once it gets to this point, it starts to blow and the seeds move around the state. Garrett went yesterday to some houses in Wilmington and that's what they had, and they had some other annual thistles. This is one that's very deep rooted and very hard to pull up. We don't usually recommend that because it breaks off and you still have the roots that come right back. That's just the seed rosette stage when it's small in the early spring. It's easy to spray then and control, but it will continue to come up because there's more seeds in the ground. So a lot of times we treat in the spring and in the fall. Just a close up of the seed head. When we're doing spraying along the road, we're using the chlorelid products called Transline usually. Stinger is a product for in corn. And in lawns, lawn trail is labeled, but it's very expensive. It's labeled for over a lot of shrubbery, but we don't usually have too many people that are willing to commit to buy it because of the price. There's quite a few products for thistle, and it's a constant issue, so we try to do different things to try to manage it. Mowing in early June and early September is a good way to also suppress it. So around your ponds, that might be something to keep in mind. Another noxious weed in Delaware is burr cucumber. This was brought on in '86. It was, at that time, there weren't any controls for it. And it was known for destroying the crop and pulling the corn down, so it was unharvestable. With our herbicide technology in the last 20 years, it's become less of a problem, but now it is around woods areas, pond areas, and streams because it moves in the water, the seed does. So if you have this one, it could be pulled up or sprayed. Go ahead to the next picture, Tracy. This is the seed head cluster of it, and the little pricks on it, the little things look like thorns. They're where it gets its name of burr cucumber. It's not real friendly if you get it on you. So it can get enclosed, and you'll know you know you've been around it. And if you notice, it has a little tendril there that helps it climb, and it climbs up other plants and any structures that are around your pond. Okay, Tracy. This one's giant ragweed, also became a noxious weed in the 80s, and it is very similar to the bird cucumber, where recent year technology has gotten it down to where it's just on field edges, wet areas, along roadside some. So we mostly treat it with Roundup, but it can get, as you'll see, go ahead, Tracy, on the next picture. Gets very tall. When I started this job in '96, we had fields like this in Delaware, and it was very detrimental to the profitability of the farms. The Roundup technology and other technology in field crops has greatly depleted this weed in Delaware and in this region. And this was just an example of how massive it can get. 5 leaves usually on a leaf of it. Those leaves are bigger than your hand, so just give you a perspective of it. And there's a seed head, looks like a little crown. And they move around with dirt and equipment and rainwater, so they can spread that way. You don't see them moving much with animals. Mice like to eat them, but they destroy them usually. One of our more recent weeds is Palmer amaranth. You notice it has some marks on the leaves where it has what they call watermarks, and this is not on all of them. It'll be just a few plants. This weed came into the region as being resistant to Roundup or glyphosate. It's a plant that has male and female plants, and these are the seed heads on them. Females, if you were to grab that top, have spikes on them, and you'll know the difference. The males don't have the spikes and the females do. These plants are able to produce up to 1.5 million seeds per plant, and the seeds are about the size of ground pepper. Just an example of how bad it can get in Delaware. This was a few years back in a soybean field. Those are about 6 feet tall, maybe 7. Just another example of the seed heads on it. This is a picture of a male Palmer amaranth on the left and a red root pigweed on the right. They're both in the amaranth family. And until they get to this stage, sometimes it's very hard to ID the difference. We have red root pigweeds, have been here for years, and we struggle to control both of them now. Before I get onto this one, the Palmer amaranth is coming up along roads and moving in dirt and construction sites. So we're struggling to keep it from moving around the state at this point. This is a picture of a harvested cornfield, probably early September, and what you're looking at, the green material, is Texas panicum. This is also a noxious weed in Delaware. It's just an example of how a weed can take over in a few years a whole field. This is down in Millsboro, where it's the dryland corn, and the corn crop was very stressed that year, and by the time they harvested, the weed had taken over the whole field. And I'm starting to see this more along roadsides and construction sites also. Just a comparison to regular crabgrass that you would have in your yard. Texas panicum to me is like crabgrass on steroids. It's not real hard to control. It's just it takes extra treatments and more money. So that's never a good thing. Just to show you the difference in the massiveness of the roots of the Texas panicum versus the crabgrass. Another picture of Mark Van Gessel when we were introducing this as a noxious weed in the state, just showing how vigorous it is if it gets enough water. I'll get into more of the invasive plants that we have in the state. This picture is not here, it's just one I borrowed on kudzu. We have about 30 spots in the state, and this is what it can do if it's left unattended. Garrett and I and Blake, when he was here, we've been treating some spots over the last 10 years. We kind of try to get one killed and move on to the next because it is labor intensive. And we use the chlorfluoride on it usually to try to leave other plants. This is what it was brought into the area. People like the smell of the flower. And back when I started here, they said it wouldn't germinate here, but we've since picked seeds off of it. We've had it grow out in the seed lab, and it will grow in Delaware and make seeds. A lot of times the sites we see, it was brought in from Pennsylvania from a stone pile or a lime pile. One spite person brought it from their child's house in the Carolinas 60 years ago. So, and been pecking at it. It's very hard to kill with not using too strong of chemicals around a house site. It brings into it what we try to do with it, and porcelain berry is once it gets up on a tree, to cut it off the trees and separate it and have it down on the ground to treat it so that you're not killing the trees, because you can definitely do that with the herbicides we're using on it. This was a patch in Felton that we treated in '99 when we started messing with it, and believe it or not, I'm still treating it every year. It's down to about 1%. It just doesn't want to go away. We've had people pass away and the sites have been left neglected, and kind of Roundup works on it, or glyphosate. We use the trans line, not use the escort or the milestone due to being more soil activity with those chemicals. And we, use a higher rate than what you would use to spray yard weeds around your sidewalk and things like that. A lot of times we treat with transline in the spring and the Roundup in the fall. That seems to be the best that we can do. We also are cutting the large stumps and painting them with Roundup solution on the base. And that's considered a cut stump treatment. I'll talk more about that on some of these other weeds. Like I say, that's me or not. Cut the trees off the vines, save the trees. Only spray the kudzu when the leaves are dry. They seem to keep a lot of water on them. So you want them to be dry when you're spraying. Cut and paint the large vines. I said that already. If you've got a spot around the pond that has this, you need to use aquatically approved herbicides that are for near water. A lot of times if it's out on a flat piece of ground and there's something there that makes a little pile, you have to spray both sides. One side won't kill it all. We usually go back 1 to 2 weeks later and retreat any missed spots. I always want to add a surfactant that's approved for the site, whether it's an upland site or a wetland site. And this is one where you don't want to believe everything you read on the internet. I've seen some bad information out there. So talk to somebody that knows their herbicides and has some experience with it. Let's see. One of the things we get into with these vines and invasive plants is to not spray over your head. I'll get in and talk about bamboo here in a minute, and that's one thing. You don't want to treat it because it's too tall. We cut it off and treat the base. When you're dealing with any of these invasive plants, watch out for what I call varmints, groundhogs, snakes, anything with holes and things that can be dangerous as far as falling down and tripping. And if you've got 4 or 5 property owners involved, you want to get them all involved and make sure everybody's on the same page of what you're trying to accomplish. One thing is to not forget goats on kudzu. They like it quite a bit. It's a legume, and they'll eat it pretty good and get it down. And once they get it to the ground and keep it down, it starts to starve the roots of it. We get a lot of calls on kudzu and bamboo. We go out to the bamboo sites because everyone's different. We did have a federal grant a few years ago that had us spraying the kudzu, and we're kind of working on old money and trying to keep it going just what we can with the money that we have. With bamboo, it is one that's always way too tall. So one of the methods is to cut it off and paint full strength glyphosate on the stump. And the papers that we hand out recommend doing that within 15 seconds. And that is probably the most critical part of it. The stumps heal over fast, but it's best to do this in the fall. Plant at that time of year is taking nutrients out of the stalks and leaves to keep the rootstock going. So in the spring and the early summer, it's not doing that. It's making leaves. So you're kind of going along how the herbicide works and how the plant's functioning. One thing that people don't realize with bamboo is it is a grass. A lot of times brush killers that are advertised don't work on it because it is a grass, and brush killers don't kill grass most of the time. So you have to make sure you're using the correct herbicide and methods to control it. I talked about the cut stump method in the 15 seconds already. The other method we use is to cut it off and let it regrow. Treat it with glyphosate after the leaves open. A lot of times when it's real small, the leaves are still rolled up and it won't take it in. It has to go through the leaves. If you cut it a month or so ago, you might have enough growth to treat this fall. For the folks that don't want to use any herbicides on it, you cut it and cover it with tarps, make it so that there's no light getting in. This is a very time-consuming thing. It has fair results, but it may take up to 2 years. I don't recommend burning the stalks. I did that once. It's about like tire fire. So don't suggest that. It may take several years to kill all the roots and the runners that you can't see under the soil. And a lot of folks talk about putting in barriers around it to contain it, and I've seen them fail quite a few times. You spray it in the spring. There are some other herbicides, but it's very technical, and I don't usually get into that too much. It's expensive, but you also still need to cut it off. So we like to treat bamboo in the fall. One that's been mentioned a couple times today is porcelainberry. I live in Melford, and it happens to be the capital of Delaware for that. They had a grant back a few years and sprayed a bunch of it, and grant ran out, and we quit spraying it, and now it's all back. But it is definitely one you want to separate from your desired trees because it will grow over them and kill them. The birds love the seeds, and that's what's moving it around. Up here at the department in Camden, the facilities guys kind of got behind this year with everything going on with COVID, and our yard where we have beds is full of this stuff. So it's definitely spreading through the region. If you don't know what the vines are that are on your property, you need to find out. You could have some wild grapes that look similar to this, but they don't get the little porcelain colored berries. Roundup is not overly effective on porcelainberry, even the small ones. That's a picture now of some that's grown up on a tree. We use the brush killers added with that to control it. But it's an ongoing thing. My yard at home, I've had to limb up my holly trees because the birds are sitting in the holly trees depositing the seeds, and I didn't want to get rid of my holly trees, so I've limbed them up so I can spray underneath of them. This picture of a white mulberry. It's another one that the birds deposit quite a bit of. And a 1 to 2 foot tree like this, you probably won't be able to pull it out. It'll have as much root as it does above the ground. So a lot of times I'll take and cut it, paint it on the base with a cut stump treatment of Roundup, or a glyphosate product. But this one here is one that spreads quite a bit around the area. Couldn't resist putting this goofy looking picture of some Bradford pears that have been topped real hard. Of course, it's springtime before they leaf out. But Bradford pears have become a tree that have spread through native areas and roadsides. This past year, DelDOT has done some what's called basal trunk treatments, and they've killed quite a few along there. But this tree spreads a lot of places, and I know it's growing around the stormwater ponds. Any of you have them in your yards, you know once they get heavy, they will break. And they're something that we need to get away from planting and try to change what we have to things that are a little bit more durable. Don't know how well glyphosate works on it. We usually use the Trichopyr products, which are your brush control products, Garlon 4, Garlon 3A. Something that's become in the big limelight lately is because of the spotted lanternfly. The tree of heaven is the host plant that they like to stay on. So our spotted lanternfly group that's trying to suppress it in Newcastle County is doing a lot of controls where they're killing this tree off. We had a unique thing happen yesterday. A lady called in and said she had poison ivy all over her yard, and it happened to be tree of heaven. And as a sprout coming up, they are very similar looking. Garrett went out and looked at it, and needless to say, in Wilmington, she had spotted lanternflies on her trees. But on my property in Milford, I found this 2 years ago, and with this one, sometimes with it being tall, they do what's called a hack and squirt method, where you take an axe and cut around the base of the tree and put the herbicide right in there. And I killed probably 10 trees last winter. So it worked pretty good. That way you're not getting it on the soil. Chemicals going directly in the plant. And you're also killing something standing. So the ones I did are in an area where they can fall down when they deteriorate. But if you're seeing this weed with bugs on it, you want to call the Department of Agriculture here and ask for the spotted lanternfly group and let them know what you've got. That's been in the media quite a bit and on social media also. Put this on here just so that you do know exactly the plant you're treating. There's some similar lookalikes, tree of heaven, but a walnut tree also looks very similar. One thing there, the tree of heaven has a distinct odor, which is not very pleasant. If you nick the bark or crush the leaves, and you would smell that. And a walnut, it has another distinct odor. They're totally different. So on any plants, make sure you know what you're working with, and make sure your herbicide that you're using has that plant on the label. Something that we haven't found in Delaware, and we really don't want to, is giant hogweed. This is a picture of two guys working on it, and you notice how they're suited up. This plant has a sap that causes skin injuries. And those skin injuries can develop into skin cancer. So it's one that's kind of monitored quite a bit. We go out if people think they have it. Cow parsnip looks a lot like it. Leaves on the giant hogweed are about 5 feet across, and cow parsnip are about 2 feet across. And it's not quite as tall, but they are similar. This plant is in Maryland, so we keep an eye on it, and we do respond to anybody that calls in. It'll make the news once in a while. Virginia, I think, was the last time, and then we get a lot of calls after that. But keep your eyes open for things that you're not sure what they are. If kids get in this and get it on them, it can be very detrimental, health and adults also. We talk about manually pulling giant hogweed. I'm not doing that. Just it's too much chance of getting it on you. Girdling the plants, that's another thing that I'd rather use a herbicide versus be that close to those plants. I know how hard it is to keep poison ivy off of you when you're working on trying to kill it. Tillage of the area, burning, spraying and cutting the stumps, using a wiper to cut it. The hack and squirt, I talked about that a little bit. That's where you do the base and around it with some herbicide. And a basal bark treatment is usually a spray, which you have to get all the way around the base. And tarps and plastic covers. I guess this really wasn't all about hogweed. This is kind of just general information on how to control things. I usually recommend herbicides because I've been doing it so long, but there are other methods that will work as long as you're patient. And just like Blake, I have a couple dogs in my house, and I'm sure they're napping right now. But if there's any questions, I guess Tracy can pull those up. And sorry for the inconvenience of me having so much trouble with being high tech.